Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler. I have a series I call A Better Human Story. At the heart of it is an idea that I have felt a conviction for more than 50 years could play a constructive role in helping human civilizations to survive. It puts things into a importantly different light, and I've continually tried to get it out there. That book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, from the University of California Press, 1984, went out there, made a bit of a splash, and then people neither had refuted any of it that it claimed to show, that shows that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. It shows that, among other things. It never refuted, but not wrestled with after a certain period of time. It just sort of disappeared. So I have no diminished confidence in in how much gets illuminated in important ways about what the challenges are we face as a species, because of the nature of the forces that I try to that I feel that I've shown have been driving things to at least a large degree. Well, I continue to try. I'm 78. I still got the fire. And at least for the time being, I want to get it out there. And so I continue to write and do various other things. My son, Aaron, got me into doing things like first being a guest on podcasts, where I did my best to put that out into the world. And then he has also taken me as an old man who came of age in a time when you wrote things, to step out and to do what I can. And some of it's really stretching it. I mean, it's, for example, I don't know actually how this one worked, but I have a weekly column in the newspapers, a couple of newspapers in the very conservative part of Virginia, where I was candidate for Congress 12 years ago. Uh, I get to say something to a lot of people with whom were involved with a rather serious drama between democracy and fascism, is one quick way of putting it. I get access to this audience. It's not all conservatives. So occasionally I write something just because, well, in this case, because I'm continue to be desperate to put out an idea that shows that the ugliness that we see in human history is not human nature writ large, because it identifies a force that can be shown to be an inevitable byproduct of a creature taking a step onto the path of civilization, meaning that they invent a new way of life and pull themselves out of the niche in which they evolved biologically. It's a crucial juncture, which people haven't looked at, how crucial it is, because it's a movement from order, which is what biological evolution creates, into disorder, which is what happens when a creature extricates itself from that order and creates a new kind of life force, which is not life force, life form, civilized society, which is the first thing in the history of life on that planet that wasn't crafted by the process of natural selection, but instead was the invention of the creature. So anyway, this week I utilized my weekly platform. I have a very small stage in which to enact my grand schemes, but I throw myself into it just the same. And I have no idea whether there was a place in the minds of any conceivable chunk of the newspaper's readership for what it was I was going to present this week. I gave myself permission to just put it out there. And the first half of the piece is to make the whole point of the piece is that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. I think that if you could prove that, which I claim to do, even that, if that were all it did was make us feel a sense that we are by nature capable of being better than what we see in human history and in the world around us, because it identifies a force that breaks people and leads to a cascading reverberation of brokenness through the human world because of the disorder that the step onto the path of civilization inevitably unleashes. The second half of the piece I'm not going to deal with because this one is the one that points toward the really fundamental idea on which I've been building for 54 years. The other idea I'll just say was that places like ancient Athens and Florence in the time of Michelangelo and various other places where human creativity just sort of bursts out in such greater proportion to the size of the population than usual, that there's something that can be concluded about that, but about the human potential. But I'm not going to go into that other than just to say that. But here's the crucial part of why I'm arguing to this newspaper audience. I realize I entitled myself to reach out to try to get my lifelong mission accomplished a little more, because I basically feel like I have not accomplished what I said to do. And I don't like failure. And I still do think it could help human civilization to survive. And the first part of the piece is dragged downward by systemic forces. Systemic forces, not human nature writ large, systemic. The heart of my case concerns the inevitable consequences of any creature's taking the step onto the path of civilization. That is, taking a step unprecedented in the history of life on its planet, a step extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing a new way of life. New way of life like agriculture compared to hunting-gathering. Hunting-gathering was continuous with all the stuff going back well into our primate past. But then a new way of life, which is not in any way continuous with the primate pattern, the civilized society. It can be pretty well proved that this fateful step will inevitably unleash a destructive systemic force, a force that will drive that creature's civilization in directions that the creature would never choose but could not avoid. Pretty well proved in my book, The Parable of the Tribes, which shows that the new system itself largely mandates how civilization will evolve, so that any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos that takes that fateful step will manifest as much ugliness as we see in the history of human civilization. The social evolutionary force inevitably unleashed by a creature's inventing a new way of life, of living, will have the inevitable effect of giving, and there are several steps missing here, but the spirit of the gangster a disproportionate say in how that creature's civilization will develop. I probably should have done that a little different instead of leaping all the way to the spirit of the gangster. To say that means that only that which can prevail in a war of all against all will survive and spread. And that leads to the spirit of the gangster, because that's what comes out of the war of all against all, which is, as Hobbes indicated in the 17th century, is what anarchy is, what it leads to. And we've seen it in our own times in places like Somalia in the 90s, and back well before that in Lebanon. Warlords, the gangster, will inevitably emerge because of the dynamic of the system. So that's regardless of the inborn nature of the particular creature that's creating the civilization. This inevitable force, acting much as evil has traditionally been envisioned. I'm not sure if it's made sense to put that in there, but it is true that if you look at how this force operates in the world, it aligns well with some of the traditional understandings in the religious framework of there being some kind of a force of evil. I think it's good to see it as evil, but you can see it other ways, that there is just a force that's inevitably emerges with the dawn of civilization, that moves through the human world, spreading brokenness in a shape-shifting way. That you can see that there is a force of brokenness that is continually working to make the human world worse. And it isn't anything supernatural. It's not Satan. It's a social evolutionary dynamic that comes from a creature that steps out of the order of the biologically evolved world and into the disorder of the anarchy that civilization inevitably emerges into. Anarchy among the civilized societies that are going to have to deal with each other. A war of all against all, the spirit of the gangster. It really holds water. I mean, I've been looking at this idea for 54 years. The heart of it isn't anything I even consider entirely my own idea. It felt like it was something shown to me in 1970. I couldn't explain what the hell that might mean, but it holds water. So I'm hoping that putting this out there in this rural Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, and over to Lynchburg, that somebody will read this and maybe have an interest. So I want to tell the story of actually what then unfolded, which was surprising. There's a commenter that comes out usually to do some battle with me on the comments where my pieces appear online. I have a picture in my mind of this fellow. He has got a very, very dim view of humanity. I mean, it's a very fire and brimstone form of fundamentalist Christianity, is what he's been conveying to me over some years. And we have exchanges. I don't mind his coming forward, but I was envisioning that he was going to really take exception to my saying to people that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, because he thinks we are such terrible creatures. And that's what's come out. And I thought he would come out and do battle with me again. But to my surprise, I'll read you what he did write online. It seemed like he was genuinely asking a question, which was a kind of a lovely surprise for me. So it gave me an opportunity to respond. So he says, so why are we worried about the southern border? Don't ask me to explain the logic there, but why are the prisons overcrowded? Why do we lock our homes and cars? Why do we need courts, police officers, gun laws, any laws? And then he quotes me. The social evolutionary force inevitably unleashed by a creature. Can you tell us, he asks, more about this force? Is this the same force that has taken over the GOP? Taken over the GOP. I have taken him to be deeply ensconced in the Trump world. So is he agreeing with me? But the answer is there is a genuine, profound connection between the force that has taken over the GOP and this force that I talk about, that's a social evolutionary force, or a force of brokenness that pushes patterns of brokenness through the world over the course of the centuries. One form changing, moving in shape-shifting ways. You can see the thing operating. You can see it operating, and you can see, for example, I've drawn a lot of picture about the various destructive forces that have been part of American civilization that have flowed together into a degree of coherence that hasn't been manifest really before, I don't think, in our history, though the slave power was back in the 1850s was somewhat comparable, and it led to a catastrophe. You can see brokenness moving through the world, and the GOP has been taken over by a force which was connected with the slave power and white supremacy and all that brokenness. But it was also, once the solid South became, democratic South became the solid Republican South, the force of white supremacy was under the same political tent as the force of corporate greed. And just to name, and then there's a certain form of religiosity that's always made the world more broken in America. And all of them came together, and now we have something which is congealed enough into a coherent force that you can say that it represents an alliance of brokenness. It is working in ways that are consistently making things more broken. And it poses an immediate threat to turn what has been the American democracy, imperfect though it has been, nonetheless a great achievement, into some form of authoritarian, even fascistic order. So it is helpful, actually, if you can see that a coherent force is rising, which became visible to me in the 1990s, but then became like the driving force of my life in the year 2004, when I saw that the Republican Party, which had before the presidency of George W. Bush been basically within the confines of basic human American covenant, that with the coming of the Bush presidency, there becomes a sociopathic quality, which is the spirit of the gangster, and which led by, in ways that I've been tracing for all this time, has led into the even more grotesque Republican Party that has been driven to subservience by a man like Donald Trump. Really something to behold. Donald Trump himself being sort of like an encyclopedia of brokenness. I mean, he's a guy who's a liar, he's a bully, he's a cheat, he is cruel. The list, other strongmen. I can't think of any strongmen who have had so many basic forms of human brokenness. And he controls the party. I never would have believed it possible. It's not like I claim to be able to see, what can happen exactly and how things can work. I've been profoundly puzzled by the means by which the good people that I've come to know out in the Shenandoah Valley could align themselves with him. I've been working on that problem, and I make claims about what I've achieved, and I'm also very honest about telling you I've been thinking about how to understand how good people are going with this. I've written probably dozens of pieces that I can say are decent pieces of work, but it's still a huge mystery. Something really bizarre. Something that shows more about human collective psychology than my maps show. You can have good people supporting the most broken human being I've ever seen. It's hard to get a handle on what that implies about how unmoored, in a sense, our human consciousness can become. I mean, I studied Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology and every other psychology I could get my hands on. I got to graduate work in clinical psych, and I've written a couple of books that are pretty psychological. Out of Weakness, Healing the Wounds That Drive Us to War. Nonetheless, I don't feel like I have a psychology which explains, in a way, the state that I can observe that exists on the, where good people get swept up by a force that's consistently destructive. It's reached the point that it actually threatens the survival of American power arrangements that these same people have revered in 4th of July observances a generation ago. Ronald Reagan's republicanism, how do you get from there to Donald Trump's republicanism? Wow, beats me. So anyway, we've got this guy on the web who publicly asked me this question. What can you tell me about this force? I mean, it's like pitching the ball right down the middle of, my plate that, tell us more about this force is the message that I've been wishing that to get from the world. So I availed myself of the opportunity by responding in this way. I very much appreciate your asking. I called him by name. It is not far from the truth to say that the attempt to tell people about this force has been the fundamental driving force of my life for more than the past half century. I have worked again and again to convey this idea in various ways and at various lengths. Perhaps the best way of my responding to your question is to direct you to a 2,000-word version of what I think proves that the step onto the path of civilization inevitably unleashes a destructive force that will drive the world of that civilization-creating creature to develop in destructive and painful ways, regardless of that creature's inborn nature. Again, the point here is that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, because the way the world isn't a reflection of our nature. And so the essay that I give a link to is titled, "The Ugliness We See in Human History is Not Human Nature Writ Large." Or maybe it should be put in less grand terms. My wife doesn't like writ large. Is not a clear picture of what we are by nature. Is that better? That essay is as accessible and brief a way of showing that truth as I've been able to do. But anyone who really wants to take a look at that picture more elaborately and in greater detail can read my 1984 book published by the University of California Press, The Parable of the Tribes, the problem of power in social evolution. Let's see. Okay. As for those questions you ask about the police, courts, criminals, and prisons, the way I connect them with what I claim to show about that inevitable destructive force is to say that the brokenness that inevitably warps how a creature's civilization evolves makes for broken people. And it is those broken people who do the broken things that make for crimes, police, courts. And then I have a link to another book of mine called Out of Weakness, Healing the Wounds That Drive Us to War. The force leads to a world of war of all against all, which leads to a kind of a wounding of various ways, including the tyrannies that result. That have that determine the formative experiences that human babies are subjected to because of the way the world is. And it makes them more broken. Imagine living under tyranny, how different that is from being the free human creatures that we were for eons. There was no such thing as being in that condition, before 10,000 years ago. Way back before even we were human, people did not live in situations like where you have in the movie The Ten Commandments, all these slaves that are just human livestock to these tyrannical powers that are imposed by force. It's really staring us right in the face. What I claim to do is to show the inevitable force that shapes things in that direction. It may be that you think that if a creature, starts to be able to invent its own way of life, oh, wow, then it's going to be able to express what it is. And therefore, the whatever it is that we see must be, well, that's the kind of creatures they are. The kind of creatures that, by a certain point in the book of Genesis, God's so disgusted with that he regrets ever having created humanity. Imagine what that expresses about the people from whom that text would come. What a sense of disgust they would have about all the brokenness that beset their world. And if you read the Bible, you can see cities get put to the sword, people get enslaved. The thing is, if you understand the nature of the order and the disorder that inevitably is marked when the creature starts to extricate itself from the order and go into an unprecedented situation, which is you've got these new life forms, civilized societies, that are going to have to interact with each other. And there's just no way that the interactions are going to be anything other than a war of all against all. And the book is titled The Parable of the Tribes. It really ain't much of a parable as that word conjures up. It's more a logical, compelling piece of analysis. It goes like this. Imagine a group of tribes all living within reach of each other. If all should choose the way of peace and limitation of what they would claim, then all may live in peace. But what if all but one chooses peace? And the other one is greedy for expansion and for getting more and more and more of control over the world, as much of the world as possible. Greed and the lust for power. Just the one out of the 20, say, 5%. Well, then what happens? Well, the thing is, there is no order to determine how that one that's bent upon predation and expansion is going to behave. It can do whatever it chooses in ways that no order is going to regulate. So they can invade their neighbor and they can exterminate those people and absorb that second chunk into the whole human world. The second chunk, now it's 2 out of 20, not just one, that is being shaped by the ways and demands of power. Power being that which can prevail in a world where it's all against all, because there is no order to regulate what a sociopathic, power-lusting, greedy actor in the system might do. So if a second option after invasion and extermination, a second option is you invade, you conquer, you subjugate, and you enslave in some way, so that the conqueror imposes its desires on how the human world is going to operate, whatever kinds of exploitation or denial of basic human rights, or whatever it is. The conqueror can do that, and the culture represented by the conquered gets treated like clay and changed into whatever the conqueror needs. Up to a point, there is a force in that direction, at least. So you can say that in this way also, the ways of power have spread through the system. The original guy, the territory of the people who are exterminated, and the territory of the people who are subjugated. And then the third option is if somebody watching that this is happening as this imperialist does his gangster-like thing. They say, hey, look what's coming our way. Let's get out of here. They retreat into the inaccessible jungles or the inaccessible Arctic or wherever it is that they can be left alone. But of the original territory, what they vacate also becomes part of the growing empire of this original thing, which wasn't willing to keep the peace. By the way, the point isn't that this is to be explained by some single bad guy, but the point rather is all it takes is one to determine that only the ways of power can survive and spread. And what appears to be a breakthrough of this innovative creature that can invent its own way of life. Oh, wow, you can create all kinds of cultures. Look at all the variety that people could create, all kinds of societies, organize all kinds of ways. And it turns out that that's not so. Because if you have a war of all against all, only those things that can prevail in a war of all against all can survive and spread. So the fourth option, and there are only four: extermination, subjugation, escape, and then there's self-defense. And what that means, however, is that once again, in order to resist power, you have to have power. So if anybody's going to try to say, well, you're not going to absorb us into your empire, they got to be able to make that stick, because in the anarchic situation, it is the ways of the gangster that determine what can prevail. And that's inevitable, regardless of the nature of the creature. So I go on to say to this fellow, as for those questions that you ask, the way I'd connect them with what I claim to show about that inevitable destructive force is to say that the brokenness that inevitably warps how a creature's civilization evolves makes for broken people. And it is those broken people who do the broken things that make for crimes, police, courts. But we need law anyway, even if people were not so broken by the inevitable war of all against all societies against all societies, that civilization inevitably brings about. Everywhere else in the systems of life on Earth, every creature has evolved to do what fits in well with the larger order that works to sustain the whole system. But once we stepped onto the path of civilization, which means being the first creatures to extricate themselves out of the niche in which they evolved biologically, it becomes imperative that some kind of artificial, that is human-made, order be imposed on all the human actors so that the system can be life-serving. And law, which is what you asked about, is one essential part of people's efforts to manage how things unfold in the human world, to let people choose how things will happen, because in a state of anarchy, it is inevitable that the course of things will be ugly. Well, that's one more point that occurs to me to make. You know, I do believe that I pretty well prove that that this social evolutionary force, the disproportionate say given to the spirit of the gangster, is an inevitable byproduct of our taking the step out of the niche in which we evolved biologically. It strikes me that in all the years I've been sort of reading what other people say about the story of our species, I don't recall reading anybody is struck by what I think is a central truth about that step, which is it is a step from order to disorder. In the history of life on Earth, there are, various things you can say are sort of this marked. At what point has a cell, the single cell, been really well constructed? And what point do we have multicellular organisms and various things like the point that I think has not been attended to, though it seems obvious, it's crucial, is that up until that point, the tendencies of evolution have continuously been the creation of synergistic relationships among the components of the overall system that are most conducive to the system surviving into the future. So it is inevitably, in a sense, a life-serving order at some level. And it encompasses the whole thing. I often quote what Gregory Bateson said, a great line, that no creature can win against its environment for long. It's just the nature of things that the relationship between predator and prey and parasite and host and all the things put all together add up to something that has been selected for because it manages to get itself into the future on an ongoing basis. All it needs is input from the sun, and you've got yourself a biosphere as far as the eye can see. And I think that I've thought a bunch about, well, why is it that all the smart people who've been thinking in evolutionary terms for more than a century and a half now, since Darwin published The Origin of Species. Why is it that this obvious discontinuity from an order into a new situation, where out of the imagination of the creature, a whole variety of things that hasn't been selected for through the process of natural selection that creates a certain kind of ongoing livability, all of a sudden, there's a creature that has created a life form out of its imagination that's going to have a whole variety of them within reach of each other. And that is how civilizations emerge in the various river valleys, interacting with each other. That it is inevitable that in this situation where nothing is in place to regulate how these societies will interact, it is inevitable that the ways of power are going to emerge as a requirement for survival, just like the warlords rose to the top in Somalia when there is anarchy there. These machine guns mounted on jeeps. The worst faces of humankind that the Somali society had to offer. Not that I know Somalis all that well, but I think that what you see is that gangsters rose to the top, not the cross section of, and likewise with human civilizations. There would be a great variety that human beings would sort of emerge with. As things went on, though, there would be this process of the war of all against all, and that it would be a selective process. It's sort of just like Darwin's in a sense, that there's all this diversity, and then there's competition. Only some will survive. But the thing is, the nature of what will survive in this case hasn't been determined by any kind of life-serving process. It is an inevitable byproduct of plunging into disorder. Life does not know how to plan for anything in advance. Life doesn't know where it's heading. It may appear to have purpose, but when we started emerging as the creatures that have a kind of consciousness that's qualitatively more powerful than anything that went before, that we were the ones that chose culture, and we just got smarter and smarter, and finally we have the capacity to do things that, okay, we don't have to be passive and start dying because our niche doesn't give us what we need. No, we can change the rules of the game. We can plant the crops we used to gather. We can herd the animals we used to hunt. We can take control of more things because we have got this human consciousness that even these smart chimpanzees and gorillas, they're not going to create anything new like that. But then we enter into terra incognita, unknown, uncharted territory. Life hasn't planned ahead. It just took a turn in a direction which has been a real mixed blessing. I don't know how to balance the plus or the minus, but what humans have created on this planet is really quite extraordinary. I'm kind of proud to be a member of a species that can do something like create an iPhone. But at the same time, the creative imagination that was our strength also led us into uncharted territories where we essentially fell into a disorder that generated a process of selection that determined significantly, no, I'm not saying altogether, determined a lot about how civilization would evolve, because only the ones that had the sufficient power to survive a war of all against all made it into the future. Lots of other human cultures that might have been way more beautiful than some of these warrior societies and tyrannies that we see emerging out of the mists of our prehistory. There may have been many of them. But the parable of the tribes says that the tribes that had that kind of wholeness, if they didn't have the necessary power, would not get their cultural pattern into the future. In every place where civilization emerged in pristine fashion, the Nile Valley, the Tigris Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow, 2 places in the New World. The process is basically what you would expect. If there were a selective process that was mandating that the ways of power and the spirit of the gangster would warp the direction of their civilization's evolution. We look upon the world and we think there's a lot of ugliness in this world that we humans have created, and it's quite true. But we allow it to reflect on ourselves, our picture of ourselves and what we are capable of. It's pretty dim. You'll notice that when people say, well, that's just human nature, they're almost invariably pointing towards something which is a limitation, a defect, or a problem with what we are by nature. We take a dim view. Original sin was another form of the dim view that we've been taught to take of ourselves. But what if that's based on a fallacy? I think it largely is. I think it can be shown by looking at the implications of that point in our social evolution, or where we took this unprecedented and fateful step onto the path of civilization. We are better creatures than having to cope with a world filled with a force of brokenness leaves us able to reveal. We have been wounded through the millennia by a selective force that drove things in directions that would be injurious at a great many levels. Simply the war of all against all, that by itself, just the warfare, all the wounds that would inflict. And then the results of that war of all against all, where gangsters get a disproportionate say in determining how the world is going to be organized. If we were able to comprehend better what that force is in the world and how it operates, we'd be more likely to be able to bring it under control. And right now, you can look at 2 ways we can destroy ourselves, human civilization, that are both obvious manifestations of our not having brought a force under control. We might destroy ourselves and in the next decade or in coming generations through a nuclear holocaust of a kind that was apparently a genuine possibility as being the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962, which means it could happen again, and maybe with a less happy outcome. If that were to happen, and we were to look at how would it be that things developed to the point where, in spite of our having had the Cuban Missile Crisis, we never got it together so that we couldn't destroy life on Earth with a massive nuclear exchange between nuclear superpowers. So, and then you look into what is it that's in the way of our doing what we'd have to do to make sure that doesn't happen. And that makes for an understanding of the need to see the force that we're up against. And that's the title of the book that's behind me. We need to find ways of creating an order in the world that prevents a nuclear holocaust. Oh, and also that prevents the kind of self-destructive course that this climate crisis represents. How catastrophic this one will be, I don't know, but it seems to be huge to me, but not probably civilization ending, but maybe a nightmarish period in our history. And how did it come about that even though a whole lot was known about a whole lot of what was required for a whole long time, without how human civilization, responding as it should. We need to understand what kind of order is required and work toward it. And for that purpose, it also helps to keep in mind how this force of disorder arose and is continuing to work in our world. To know that what we're up against is a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse. Not personified, just a function about the consequences of a creature stepping out of the natural order. And I think the reason why people haven't looked at that as much as you might think that they would have, because evolutionary thinking, as I said, it's been around. The 19th century was full of evolutionary thinking, and it's basically been the organizing principle of our whole understanding of the life on Earth. It's basically the Darwinian perspective. And I think it's because the original concept of the evolutionary process was focused at the level of the particular, like this struggle for survival of the fittest, the struggle for power, the struggle for life, the competition. And that's a real dimension of the thing, and there is that competition. But this was a capitalist, imperialist European world that the evolutionary thinking began on, where there was a belief in the right of the Europeans to subjugate and transform the cultures of other people who didn't want you there. And it was a culture that was dominated by a kind of laissez-faire economic theory about the success in a competitive struggle for power and wealth was rewarding what was best. The most efficient producer, etc. The government should not do anything to take control of, well, in that society, there was a neglect to consider the overarching harmonic system. The laissez-faire economics, individualistic, muscular Christianity, imperialist, they didn't want to hear about the need for an overarching order. An overarching order would have had the French out of Algeria. I'm watching the film, The Battle of Algiers. It's got me thinking about how profound a thing it is that so many peoples have been subjugated by a external power because they had the raw power to do it. I try to show why that's an inevitability. It was inevitable that a civilization, when it emerged, it would be in a place where there wasn't any natural order to make sure that the interactions were whole. And there wouldn't be any way that this fragmented system of societies that had no way of getting it together and create an order, much less enforce it, that it would be inevitable that that business about this inevitable spread of the ways of power would take civilization of any creature on any planet in that direction. But that's really what happened there. The crucial thing that happened with the beginnings of civilization was that for the first time in the history of life, which had been going on for 3.5 billion years, a creature had taken this step, changing, I mean, from primate to parting from the chimpanzees 6 or 7 million years ago to hunting gathering societies, a real continuity. And all of a sudden, there are steps being taken because this creature is able to say, I could do this, I could do that. And they change the terms of their life. And they create something that had never been there before. And there are a variety of these somethings, and they're going to have to interact with each other. And an inevitable consequence is that creature's, the world of that civilization creating creature is going to be quite broken because there's a force that gets unleashed that's not been brought under control. Turns out that if you're going to create civilization, you've got a challenge. It may seem like you're controlling the world, which we are, which we have been, but we're also putting ourselves in the process that's out of control. And it's not easily brought under control. I mean, you don't get from there to where we got to get to in one easy step. I don't know how possible it is for our species to get its act together. But I've been driven by the thought that there's a way of understanding what we're up against that will make it more likely that we are able to overcome it and survive for the long haul on this planet. And there's a part of me that feels very invested in the future of our species. I mean, I can imagine, like, in 500 years from now, our civilization will have proven to be catastrophic. And if any of it remained, it would be like, this was not the future we wanted for our descendants. This is not what we wanted the story of our species on this planet to look like. There's something that's happened on this planet, and then which is life, which looks kind of sacred in some ways. And then there's something that's happened with our species taking the step and creating a whole new phase in the history of life, part of which is a challenge to that creature to try to bring that bucking bronco of social evolution under control so it can choose which direction it goes, rather than have a systemic dynamic that selects for not necessarily what you'd want selected for. I mean, there are some virtues to having power succeed. I mean, power keeps people, its livestock well fed enough to do the work. Better than starving to death. But it's hardly what you'd want if you were going to design a culture to maximize the good being defined by, I would say, well, the experience of fulfillment of the human beings within it, and the harmony and health of the life in general. Won't go into a definition of the good, which emerges out of the evolutionary perspective, but there is one. So I keep on trying to get out there a way of looking at it. What is the force that got us into as much brokenness as we're into? And where do we need to get to so that our species doesn't self-destruct? Those are related questions in my mind. And I hope that you'll be interested in knowing whether I actually deliver those goods that sort of show that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, and it makes sense to imagine a world that is the one that human beings could bring about if they had a free choice about the matter. And I think that we know that people would choose a world in which there's justice rather than injustice. That people would prefer peace to war. That they want a world in which there's more love and less hate rather than more hate and less war. I think that human beings in general would make those choices. And I believe that though it be a real challenge to create a world in which all of those better sides of our potentialities got realized, I think that if we did have a choice about how to design civilization, I mean, we're never going to have that choice. I mean, we're always going to emerge into whatever future having to deal with everything is broken right now and how it evolves in us in terms of our thoughts and our feelings and our values. We're the products of a history in which the spirit of the gangster has had way too much say about how the world is. But we've got the makings. And I think we will be buoyed up in that process if we see ourselves as creatures that, if we did get a choice, we actually would be able to use our values to get peace and love and justice, and that would use our ingenuity to try to build that into our world to as great as an extent as possible, to enough extent that we don't end up with a nuclear holocaust or a complete environmental catastrophe. So if you go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, you'll see this all laid out in a variety of ways. So if all this actually could be shown, that we are better creatures than who we have thought ourselves to be, and that there is this coherent force that is good for us to see so that we understand what the nature of the challenge is to make our world more whole, both at the level of making us believe ourselves capable of more, which I think we'd live up to our expectations rather than down to them, and to understanding sort of like what the overall task is, which is rather comprehensive, to make a more whole world. But everything is connected in terms of causes and effects, and healing our world is a process that is many dimensional, and a lot of the brokenness and the wounds stem from this particular force, and we could see that it is an operative, and we can ask ourselves, how do we make this piece of brokenness more whole? How do we design a civilization that can make it for the long haul? And then to ask, well, if we got to get there for us to maximize the chance that those things that would make up the good in the ideal future, sorry about this. If this is where we got to get to, if this is how the world has to look, so that that reverberation of that force has been brought under control sufficiently that we're not playing Russian roulette with human survival, then we can ask ourselves, with that destination in mind, what steps could we wisely and prudently take now that we maximize the chance that we'll eventually get to that destination? That's I don't have any magic maps about how we get from here to there, but there are a lot of places of brokenness in the world that can be addressed, and they are all pretty much connected. Seeing things whole is important. So our consciousness, like with the beginnings of the ages of evolution, was about evolution being looking at the survival of the fittest, but not looking at the comprehensive order that works through getting the whole system into the future as best it can, and given occasional asteroids hitting the planet or ice ages, and all kinds of other things that are not under the control of life. Nonetheless, you can see the river moving for 3.5 billion years, where what can survive gets its DNA into the future. And then you have this profound break. But if you're not looking at the way those 3.5 billion years created not just this species and that species, but this ecosystem, excessive individualism perhaps is reflected there. That's my one theory I've got, that maybe if you look at our culture more comprehensively, you would find that there's a lack of understanding of the extent to which one of our challenges is to impose a life-serving order on things where necessary. Maybe that's because our world has been so much the product of imperialist European civilization and so much the product of laissez-faire capitalist robber barons. Indeed, it is the world that those people created that has a brokenness to it. That is the product of the threat to human survival. If humankind hasn't made the response that a decently responsible civilization would have once the scientists started giving the warning about climate change. The reason is because of the ability of a powerful and wealthy industry to paralyze a whole great nation like the United States from taking action. So there are lots of different forms of this kind of brokenness. The greed of the fossil fuel industry. It's an entity, a corporate entity that has emerged out of a century and 3/4 of capitalist market competition, as an entity that will choose to paralyze the civilization from taking responsible steps to protect future generations in order to avoid taking any kind of hit on their short-term profits. It has become, whatever it was along the way, the fossil fuel industry, by the time the issue of climate change came about, was a force that was willing to sacrifice the human future for its own short-term profits. Killing for money. Now, I think that we're talking about something systemic there too. And I do have a book on that subject called The Illusion of Choice, How the Market Economy Shapes Our Destiny. That at least provides a framework for asking, how is it that you get to the point where you've got corporations that are willing to kill for money? And it isn't just the fossil fuel industry. We see it with asbestos and tobacco and a variety of other places. My wife and I were just watching Silkwood, about the nuclear power industry. They were killing for money. I couldn't watch it. I've become kind of wimpy in my old age. I watched a lot of Silkwood. Now, Silkwood is about this woman played by Karen Silkwood, who works in Oklahoma for Kerr McGee, and it's got to do with, and basically the workers are being killed. And Kerr McGee is not willing to do what would be required to give them adequate protections. And Silkwood gets killed. It is an ugly world, and there is that dimension. And I don't think that most human beings would kill for money. I don't think I'm naively optimistic that the great majority of people who would not kill for money. Yet, every time an industry is in a situation like asbestos or tobacco or whatever, where they can choose between taking responsibility in a way that the society needs because there are great stakes involved and thousands of lives or the whole human future or whatever. And they've always chosen to hide the truth, like the Tobacco Institute. And I have a friend who makes a great living testifying against the asbestos companies that killed for money for years. But I don't think that, it seems that every industry is willing to kill for money. So here we have a sub-force, I think, at work, which is that something is happening in the world of corporate evolution in a competitive market in which whatever is regulated and whatever isn't regulated. And in every case, whether the tobacco industry or the fossil fuel industry or the asbestos industry, in every case, what you end up with is an industry that's willing to do something that the great majority of people, according to my, I'm postulating, the great majority of people, 95%, wouldn't, but every single industry would. So what is happening in that economic system that is leading to these powerful industries becoming these kinds of entities in moral and human terms? They're willing to kill for money. You could get into the details of exactly what all these people do that's ugly out there in the human world, that you really wouldn't want to have so much power in the hands of those kinds of entities. But at least one of them is killing for money. So what's going on in the system to make something universal that's only a bit rare in the human world? It's sort of like the parable of the tribes. You remember the one, imagine that they all want to live in peace and take nothing more than what is theirs. Then all may live in peace. But what if all but one? And then I showed how that would spread throughout the system. So maybe there's some kind of a dynamic going on there in the ways that industry inevitably will evolve to become, so that they are, in terms of being actors, they are not representative of what a human being would do. So how do you get these sociopathic monsters like the fossil fuel industry, as a force that buys a political party, the Republican Party, of course, in these times, willing to be bought because they're morally bankrupt, which is another story, but buys a Republican Party that's willing to do what they know is to spread lies and doubts and such like that. I ran for Congress in this Republican area, and this is even before Trump. The way they treated, I've been on television dealing with a Republican in a little debate about climate change, and they're saying, unproven science and all that. This is something where the fossil fuel industry bought a political party, and that political party has basically been powerful enough to prevent the United States from doing a whole lot of things that should have been done, that were obviously that should be done, given what was already known and given the stakes. I don't even like to think about the stakes. I was just flashing on the idea of how much trouble civilization's having right now with the migrations that we've had. Like a Syrian civil war, and Europe is flooded with Syrian refugees. All the disruption and disturbance in politics of nations, from Hungary to Germany to Sweden, because of that bit of. But what if you get climate change causing massive migrations? I mean, what kind of droughts are there going to be? What kind of, if you've got rising oceans and changing patterns of rain and dry, and you get maybe changing global ocean currents, changing the climate, like in Europe. Where are we heading? I mean, I really don't like to think about that. Both the kinds of the pains of the disruption that would be caused by, the planet changing on various populations in ways that interfere with their ability to continue to live there. There's uninhabitable places because of envisioned heat that humans can't survive. I think in places like Iraq, I think they're talking about things like that. How worried to be? I don't even want to think about it. But then, there's also what all that means for the human world in terms of what we've seen, the immigration issue being for the politics of countries. I mean, we liberals like to think of ourselves as taking a humanitarian position with respect to immigration, and I think we should be as humanitarian as we can be. But we also have to keep in mind, whatever it is implied by what we can see happening politically in societies, when immigration becomes the issue that it becomes when there's a lot of people flowing in, especially people who are really different. And it's always people who are really different now. I mean, I don't know, maybe people in 19th century America thought the Irish were really different. But, you know, these days we're talking about waves of immigration from North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, or, you know, Arabs and Muslims, and the difficulty that societies obviously have dealing with having an influx of people who are experienced by the people who are already there as different from them in some meaningful way. I think it's just hard for people to navigate it. I don't know if there's a lot to learn about how to navigate it better, but I think we need to take into account that one of the crucial things is we shouldn't feed power to the fascistic forces that apparently are lurking in a lot of democratic societies, whether it's the fascist force that did so well in recent German regional elections, the most right-wing force since the Nazis to assume certain kind of power. Feeding force like Le Pen's force in France, which is poised to take control for the first time. In what's you know, what happened to Hungary, but then also to mention that clearly there's something about immigration that's hard for a lot of Americans to feel comfortable about. And the effect of their discomfort is, just like in these other countries, to move people in the direction of giving more support to fascist force. Getting people into an us versus them frame of reference. And it helps to lie, you know, like Trump does about the terrible things that immigrants are doing, like they're all murderers and rapists and bringing in fentanyl, where in fact, as far as I've been able to tell, I think the consistent finding is that illegal immigrants are committing crimes at a lower rate than the overall American population. They are less criminal than the average American population. But I think that there's more to it. I think that the receptiveness to lies is reflective of a difficulty dealing with people who are different. I don't know. I think the only way you're going to not have a backlash from what would be perhaps an optimal immigration policy is if you have a whole population that is able to connect in a positive way with having people in their presence who are different in this way and that way. I don't feel sure how possible that is, but I do think that we, as civilization, one of the reasons why it's important to minimize the things we're doing that produce climate change, to accelerate our efforts to bring that under control, is the understanding that one of the consequences of failure is that that may trigger more migration in the world, And that in turn our world is showing. It has a corrosive effect on how people deal with power and with other people. That it creates, it feeds the spirit of fascism. And by the way, the idea, the spirit of fascism, it is a way of talking about something that can be traced back all the way through the concept of evil as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, all the way back to the inevitable emergence of a destructive selective force for any creature that steps out of the biological order in which it evolves and plunges into the disorder that civilization represents inevitably from the outset. Thank you very much. If I interest you, I hope you'll go to other videos, subscribe and stuff like that. And I also hope that you'll go to A Better Human Story, or to that book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, or to that book up there, What We're Up Against. If you're interested in seeing, there's a force to be seen here that accounts for much of what's gone wrong in America, in the human world, and points the way toward our doing better to get where